All right, you guys really wanted us to deep dive this one, and, well, let's just say it's a doozy.
Yeah, the Caylee Anthony case.
A case that really, I think a lot of people are still thinking about even now. It just sort of gets under your skin.
It does.
2-year-old Caylee Anthony disappears
Right.
from Orlando, Florida back in 2008. It's just suddenly the whole world is watching. I mean, you couldn't escape it.
Oh, it was everywhere. The media just went nuts. It was on every channel. And of course, the trial was just as intense, maybe even more so.
And then the verdict. Oh, boy, that verdict.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say it sparked quite a bit of debate, to put it lightly.
A lot of people were not happy.
To say the least, right. And, what makes this case so fascinating, I think, is that it wasn't your typical whodunit. I mean, the prosecution's case, it was all about circumstantial evidence. They had to build a case out of a bunch of little pieces, hoping the jury would connect the dots.
It's a lot harder to prove than, say, if you have DNA evidence or a clear eyewitness.
You're asking the jury to draw conclusions based on possibilities, inferences, and, well, that can be pretty tricky. But, okay, let's rewind a bit. Go back at the beginning.
Okay.
June 16th, 2008. That's the last day anyone sees little Caylee. She's at her grandparents' house.
Right, with her mom, Caylee Anthony.
And then, poof, gone. Just like that.
But the really strange thing is that it takes a whole month before Caylee's grandmother, Cindy Anthony, finally makes that 911 call.
A whole month?
Yeah, July 15th. And in that call, she's not only saying, hey, I haven't seen Caylee in a month, she's also talking about this suspicious odor in Casey's car.
Oh, that detail.
Right
from the get-go, it makes you think, something's not right here.
Yeah, it definitely casts some suspicion on Caylee.
And not just the smell either, right?
Yeah.
Think about it. If your child has been missing for a month, wouldn't you be, I don't know, just a wreck?
You'd think so.
But Casey's behavior during that time, it's a little, well, perplexing.
To say the least. It was bizarre.
Instead of, frantically searching for her daughter, she's partying, getting a tattoo, even moving in with her boyfriend.
Yeah, none of that really adds up to what you'd expect from a grieving mother. It just fueled the public suspicion and really set the stage for this massive media circus that the trial would become.
And then, boom, the discovery that changes everything. December 11th, 2008, 6 agonizing months after Caylee disappears. A utility worker just doing his job stumbles upon skeletal remains.
In a wooded area.
Not too far from the Anthony family home.
Yeah, and they're wrapped in a blanket, stuffed in a laundry bag. Tragic.
Absolutely heartbreaking. And those remains, of course, they're confirmed to be Caylee's. The medical examiner rules it a homicide, but the exact cause of death, it's a mystery. Decomposition,
Yeah, and that decomposition, unfortunately, it really limits the amount of forensic evidence they could gather.
Right, but they do find a few clues, a few potential pieces of the puzzle. There's duct tape near the skull and remnants of a Winnie the Pooh blanket.
Ringing any bells?
Well, yeah. Items just like those were found back at the Anthony house.
So we have some possible connections.
It's like, okay, we're starting to see a picture emerge, but there's still a lot of gaps. Nothing definitive yet, right?
Right, exactly. Those items, they raise suspicions, of course, but they don't directly link Caylee to the crime scene. That's the tough thing about circumstantial evidence. It's all about asking the jury to make inferences. They have to draw conclusions based on these individual pieces, and that's never a guarantee.
Okay, so fast forward to 2011. The trial begins, and let me tell you, it was a media frenzy unlike anything I'd ever seen.
Oh, yeah, it was huge.
The prosecution, they're going for the death penalty. Their argument is that Casey killed Caylee to basically get rid of the responsibilities of being a mom.
And they suggest she may have used chloroform and duct tape to suffocate her?
So their case, it really hinges on weaving together all these pieces of circumstantial evidence. There are those Google searches for chloroform on the family computer, witness testimony about Casey's behavior while Caylee was missing, all that partying and whatnot.
Right, and you can't forget the expert testimony about the odor in Casey's car, that hint of decomposition.
Each piece, on its own, might not be enough to convict, but put them all together and, well, you can see what the prosecution was going for.
They were trying to paint a very specific picture for the jury.
But of course, the defense had their own story to tell, and it was a completely different one. They claimed that Caylee's death was an accident, that she drowned in the family pool.
And that Caylee, along with her father, George Anthony, panicked and covered up the accident out of fear.
And that's where things get really interesting, because the defense, They went even further. Remember those allegations of sexual abuse that were circulating?
Oh, right.
The defense trying to introduce the idea that Casey had been abused by her father and, that maybe this abuse could explain her behavior, her tendency to lie.
It was a very bold move, extremely controversial. They were trying to shift the focus, cast doubt on Casey's credibility, while simultaneously pointing a finger elsewhere. But the problem was, there wasn't really any concrete evidence to support those abuse claims.
Yeah, George Anthony, he vehemently denied those accusations.
Yeah.
And in the end, the judge actually instructs the jury to disregard them completely because of the lack of evidence. But, even though the judge said that, the damage might have already been done. It definitely planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the public.
Oh, absolutely. And you can see what the defense was trying to do, right? Create that reasonable doubt. They're poking holes in the prosecution's timeline, offering alternative explanations, trying to muddy the waters.
It was a high-stakes gamble for sure. Playing on emotions, the complexity of family relationships, it was a lot to take in.
For the jury, but also for the public who was watching this whole thing unfold. You got to give the defense some credit, though. They had their work cut out for them.
Oh, totally.
Right.
They were up against a wall of, well, maybe not evidence, but definitely suspicion.
Right. And their whole strategy seemed to be to kind of chip away at that prosecution's case little by little.
Yeah.
Introduce enough doubt to make that whole beyond a reasonable doubt thing almost, well, impossible.
It's like they were playing like 4D chess or something.
Right.
And the prosecution's over there with checkers. I mean, come on. Suggesting that Casey's own dad, George, might have been involved in a cover-up, that's a big swing.
It was a huge swing, but they were building on something. There were already these, cracks in the story.
Oh, yeah.
Inconsistencies in what George Anthony had told the police about, when he last saw Caylee.
The details weren't adding up.
Exactly. And then you have those moments in the trial when George Anthony's on the stand and he just breaks down.
Oh, yeah.
Sobbing, overwhelmed with grief, with guilt, it seemed.
Powerful stuff.
And the defense, they used those moments. They were saying, look, this emotional outburst, maybe it's a sign of something else going on here.
Like he's hiding something.
Exactly. A father protecting his daughter, even if it means, not telling the whole truth. The jury, they had to consider that. Of course, George Anthony always denied any involvement in Caylee's death or any kind of cover-up. But that seed of doubt, it was planted.
Let's get back to those air samples from Casey's trunk, though. I'll be honest, when I first heard about that, I thought, okay, well, that's it. That's the smoking gun. But you're saying it wasn't so simple?
Not really. Forensic science, it's not like on TV. You don't get that one perfect piece of evidence that solves everything. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Right.
It's more like a puzzle where the pieces don't always fit perfectly.
Okay, so break it down for me then. What were they even testing for in those air samples? And why was it so controversial?
So the prosecution, they had this star witness, Dr. Arpad Voss. He's a forensic anthropologist, and get this, an expert in the scent of death.
The scent of death.
Yeah, I know, right? He'd been working on this new way to analyze volatile organic compounds.
Yeah.
Basically, chemicals that get released when a body decomposes.
So like you're trying to capture the smell of death in an air sample.
Kind of, yeah. You see, when a body decomposes, it lets off hundreds of these compounds.
Okay.
Some of them are pretty unique to human decomposition, like chloroform. Dr. Vass said his analysis of the air from Casey's trunk showed really high levels of chloroform, along with other compounds that he linked to human remains.
Sounds pretty damning.
It does.
But the defense, they weren't buying it. They were saying that this whole scent of death thing, it's too new, too untested to be reliable.
Right, exactly.
And didn't they bring in their own experts to try and debunk it?
They did, and they argued that the compounds that Dr. Voss found, especially that chloroform, it could have come from something else.
Okay, like what?
Well, remember, they found that garbage bag in the trunk.
Right.
Household cleaners, even some food, can have trace amounts of those chemicals.
Interesting.
Plus, there's always a chance of contamination.
Oh, yes, especially with a case this big. Everyone and their mother was probably poking around that car.
Exactly.
So basically, you have these two groups of experts, each looking at the same data, but coming to totally different conclusions.
Right. It's like that classic battle of the experts, but it's up to the jury, who probably don't have, PhDs in chemistry, to figure out who to believe.
Talk about pressure.
Right. How are they supposed to make sense of all that? But that's exactly what they had to do. Weigh the credibility of each expert and decide whose interpretation of the science was more convincing. And in this case, well, the defense did a pretty good job of creating that doubt. They made the jury question whether they could really trust this whole scent of death analysis.
It's like watching a legal thriller, the way the defense just kept chipping away at the prosecution's case, point by point. But we can't forget the elephant in the room, right? The media. I mean, this case was everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Nonstop coverage. Was there any way for the jury to escape all of that, all the speculation, all the opinions?
That's the question that hung over this whole case.
Yeah.
I mean, the Caylee Anthony trial, they called it, like, the social media trial of the century.
For a reason.
For a reason. It was one of the first cases where you really saw the power of 247 News and, like, the rise of social media.
Right.
Creating this, like, echo chamber of commentary and speculation.
And judgment. Don't forget the judgment.
Oh, yeah. Lots of judgment.
It was like the whole world had already made up their mind about Caylee Anthony before the trial even started.
Exactly. And it made it so hard to separate, you know, public opinion from the actual legal proceedings. The defense actually tried to argue that all this media attention had basically poisoned the jury pool.
Yeah, they wanted to move the trial to a different location.
Change of venue, right.
But the judge said no.
He denied the request. But it raises all these questions, right? Like, how much did all that media pressure actually affect the trial? Could the jurors really be impartial after being bombarded with all those headlines and opinions?
It's almost like the media was having its own trial, running parallel to the one in the courtroom.
Mm.
So how did all of this play out? I mean, did any of those jurors ever talk about what it was like, you know, trying to make a decision with all that noise swirling around?
Well, a few of them did actually speak out later on, and what they said was pretty interesting. They admitted that even though they weren't totally convinced Casey was innocent, they still felt that the prosecution hadn't really tied it all together.
Like there were too many loose ends.
Exactly. The lack of a clear cause of death, the holes in the timeline, the different explanations the defense had put forward, it all added up to that reasonable doubt.
So it wasn't about proving that Casey didn't do it. It was about whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that she did. And, well, they didn't think they had.
Right. That's the thing about our legal system.
It's about that burden of proof.
Right. But I get it. For a lot of people, it felt like a technicality, a loophole that let someone who they thought was guilty walk free.
The Caylee Anthony case, it really became a lightning rod. It sparked these massive debates about the role of media in these kinds of high-profile cases, the limits of forensic science, and, well, what justice even means.
And it really brought the issue of child safety and parental responsibility to the forefront.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, a lot of states, they were spurred by this case, by the public outcry, to start pushing for laws that would make it like a crime for parents not to report a missing child quickly enough.
Caylee's Law, right.
Exactly, Caylee's Law. But even those laws, they've been controversial. Some people say they could lead to, like, parents being unfairly accused or punished.
It's a really tough issue.
It is. But it just shows how deeply Caylee's story affected people. It became a symbol. And even though people didn't always agree on how to prevent something like this from happening again, they wanted to do something. So we've talked about the evidence, the different sides of the story, how the media just blew this whole thing up. But there's still that big question. What happened when it was all over? When the jury actually had to make a decision.
Yeah, and a decision that I think a lot of people weren't expecting.
Right. When they announced that they had found Caylee Anthony not guilty of those big charges, the murder charge, the aggravated child abuse, manslaughter, it was like a bomb went off.
I mean, remember, the prosecution wanted the death penalty, and then suddenly she's acquitted. I can't imagine how people reacted to that.
Oh, it was intense. Protests, outrage, all over the news, social media, everyone was talking about it. People felt like the justice system had completely failed, that Caylee didn't get justice. The story that everyone had sort of settled on, the idea of this, you know, cold-hearted mom who just wanted to get rid of her kid, it just didn't fit with the verdict.
It's like this disconnect, right, between what we think is right, what feels right, and what the law actually says and what it can prove.
Exactly. The jury, they had to block out all that noise, all the emotion, everything they were hearing in the media. They had to just focus on the evidence, what was presented in the courtroom, and whether that evidence was enough to say, without a shadow of a doubt, that she was guilty.
And with a case that relied so much on circumstantial evidence, that's a really high bar to clear. Did any of those jurors ever talk about how they came to their decision, how they dealt with that doubt?
A couple of them did, actually, and it's really interesting to hear what they had to say. They said that they weren't necessarily convinced that Casey was innocent, but they didn't think the prosecution had proven their case definitively. There was no clear cause of death. There were holes in the timeline, the defense had offered up other possible explanations, and all of that created enough reasonable doubt.
So it wasn't about proving that she didn't do it. It was about whether the state had actually proven that she did.
Right. That's a really important distinction. It's the whole foundation of our legal system. But for a lot of people, it felt like a technicality, a loophole that allowed someone they thought was guilty to go free.
This case really turned into a much bigger conversation. It made us question the role of the media, how much they influence what we think. It showed the limits of what forensic science can tell us, and it even made us ask, well, what is justice? How do we define that?
And it reignited this whole discussion about how we keep children safe and what it means to be a responsible parent. A bunch of states actually started pushing for laws, Caylee's Law, they called them, to punish parents more severely if they didn't report a missing child quickly enough.
I remember that. Those laws were pretty controversial, weren't they?
Yeah, some people argued that they could actually end up harming families, by making parents afraid to report anything or by punishing them when they had good reasons for not reporting right away.
It's complicated.
Really complicated, but it just shows how much Caylee's story touched people. It became this symbol, this push for change, even if people disagreed on what that change should look like.
So after all of this, the investigation, the trial, the media circus, all the debate, what can we take away from the Caylee Anthony case? What did we learn?
I think it reminds us that sometimes, even in cases that everyone is obsessed with, the truth can be really hard to find. We want simple answers. We want to see justice served. But the legal system, it's not always about that. It has to protect everyone's rights, even when those rights don't line up with what the public wants.
And maybe, even more importantly, it shows us how much our own biases and assumptions can affect how we see things. We all have opinions, especially in a case like this where the media is constantly feeding us information and interpretations. The Caylee Anthony case, it's one that people are still talking about, still debating. And I think it's a good reminder that the search for justice, for the truth, it's not always a straight line. It's messy, it's full of uncertainty, and sometimes there just aren't easy answers.
It certainly makes you think, and hopefully it makes us more aware of how we form our own opinions, how we interpret the information we're given.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it, folks. Another deep dive complete. We covered a lot of ground today.
We did.
And I hope this deep dive gave you all something to think about, maybe even sparked some interesting conversations. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.